Hello, welcome to IDT Talks. My name is Anastasia Lavrina, and in this edition we are going to talk about the cooperation between the European Union and Central Asian states, as well as between the European Union and China, all of those tensions and the perspective for the future. Our special guest now is Samuel Vesterbye, Managing Director at European Neighbourhood Council, who is joining IDT Talks from Brussels. Hello and welcome to our program.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. So most recently, the foreign ministers of Central Asia and the European Union held a full format meeting for the first time. During the meeting, a joint roadmap was presented to deepen relations between the Central Asia and the European Union states. Where do you see the perspectives for the future cooperation between two sides?
Well, for a long time, the EU and Central Asia have been flirting with an important relationship that's based around critical raw materials, that's based around the circumvention of the Northern Corridor, that's also based around some natural connectivity routes which exist between the Western Balkans, Turkey, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Of course, also other areas like critical raw materials and the need, of course, to have consumer markets and better people-to-people relations and so forth. So that's kind of the basis of this relationship. And what we've seen is that gradually, especially over the last 2 years, that relationship has grown and become more and more important, but also facing many risks and many problems along the way. So one has to look at it a little bit like a relationship which grows in importance, but that has some bottleneck problems along the way. And so everyone who's analyzing it and dealing with it says, wow, there is enormous potential in this relationship. We see more and more treaties, more and more MOUs, more and more various types of documents being signed, and more high-level meetings taking place. However, at the same time, we also see a lot of issues occurring, security risks along the way, conflict problems, and so forth. And so I think when the Central Asian foreign ministers met with the Foreign Affairs Council, in Luxembourg last week on Monday, I think the joint statement which came out of it, especially one part, which is the key area 4, which is about security challenges, was really important. And in many ways clarifies that the type of work that the EU has been doing with Central Asia, for example, on border management, BOMCA, on drug reduction, CADAP, on also dialogues with regards to counterterrorism, which is another one, which is called LECA. All of these are really, really important and continue being important. And you can see how much importance the Central Asian republics are giving to the security outreach, which is coming from the European Union, because as everyone knows, once there is such an establishment of relations, supply chains, investments, and so forth between two regions, inevitably, all of this can only rest on a security pillar. And so that's why the addressing of common security challenges, which is in the 79 points of the EU foreign ministers and the Central Asian foreign ministers, which were signed and agreed on late into the evening on Sunday night and approved on Monday morning last week, is simply so important for the relationship.
So can we say that the security and energy are top priorities for two sides to develop cooperation in the future, I mean, between the European Union and Central Asian states?
Yes, I think that's 100% true, in a sense that the energy, critical raw materials meaning important raw materials, chemical raw materials, which can be used for solar panels, or which can be used for other types of renewable energy transmission, storage, battery, lithium, and so forth. All of these issues are top priority for the EU. And I know that energy is critical. I mean, energy in the traditional sense, like fossil fuels, is still very critical today, and is not going to go away in the next 10 years. So the relationship, between Kazakhstan and the EU, or Uzbekistan and the EU, Turkmenistan and the EU, Azerbaijan and the EU, and so forth, they're not going to be irrelevant when it comes to fossil fuels. But the really important part that everyone is betting on, and the really important part where we see enormous technological development, are the critical raw materials. And so when it comes to those, as you correctly mentioned, those are the pillar, and those are natural glue, right? In the sense that we need them, they have them. There can be supply chain hubs along the way, which create supply chain capability so that countries are not only fossil fuel providers in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, everyone likes to be able to provide fossil fuels, but fossil fuels are a very singular type of energy, which essentially will not be able to provide everything that's needed for the EU. And so as a result, it's important also to be able to diversify into other areas, and their supply chain hubs are very important. And so I think all of this, as I mentioned before, very much rests on a good security relationship between the two. And I think the fact that the joint statement from last Monday, in point number 54, says explore new possibilities of engagement between the EU and Central Asian countries based on respective requests, interests, and needs, including through the European Peace Facility. This is revolutionarily important in terms of international relations between the two regions. It's never been written before. And as anyone who studies a little bit of international relations in the EU knows, the European Peace Facility is a very, very large military and peace and security facility that already contributes towards 9 EU military operations, including the EU MMM in Ukraine, but also other ones in Africa and elsewhere. And so it's very clear that both the EU and Central Asia want to engage in a better economic relationship, a stronger supply chain relationship, but at the same time also one of security.
Well, when we speak about energy, raw materials, we shouldn't forget about the Southern Gas Corridor, the existing pipelines, and the intention of the European Union states to develop cooperation with Azerbaijan in the region of the South Caucasus to make sure that there are additional sources available and required for energy security of the European Union. Then can the European Union, I mean, from your answer, what you are saying, the European Union, I can conclude, also see the Central Asian states as contributors to the existing energy pipelines in the region.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But one has to be cautious about the level of investment which will go into fossil fuels as opposed to renewables. So this very much depends on each member state's needs. Some of it is bilateral, some of it is EU-led, some of it receives financing from member states, some receives financing from the EU. And I think realistically, the only country in Central Asia which can top up the energy needs of the EU through fossil fuel options would be Turkmenistan. But as I think is pretty clear already, many member states are hesitant about that. And I think they've already fulfilled their needs with Azerbaijan. And to increase that further, I think remains a big question mark.
I think we cannot ignore the growing influence of Turkey in Central Asia. Doesn't matter whether it comes to energy, economic cooperation, or the military partnership. How can it help to the European Union?
So Turkey is an interesting country because if you have to be really, really blunt about the relationship that different countries have in Central Asia, I would say that Turkey has a very, very good human relationship, very good cultural relationship. Turkey is a country that's, for example, in some of the polls are shown that Turkey is the most popular foreign country for a country like Kyrgyzstan. It's ranked very, very highly among the other countries. It's seen very positively in many Central Asian republics, more positively than Russia or the US or China or other countries. And then at the same time, Turkey has a special relationship with these countries because, you know, for a long time it's had a very, very strong presence in the construction sector and also in other economic sectors across the region. And of course, it has a cultural relationship which goes back far. And if you look at kind of the soft power influence of Turkey in the region is relatively high, whether it's through educational facilities or Yunus Emre or other types of institutions and so on. But when it comes to actual money put on the table, it's limited. That's the reality. I mean, the ones who are really putting in an enormous amount of money in this region are China and the EU, and arguably China more. And so Turkey is one of those interesting countries that has a soft power skill which is needed by everyone and which is essential in the region, but it doesn't really add massive definitely doesn't add any multi-billion projects in the region at all, but it might add a few multi-million projects in the region, which are of course appreciated. But Turkey without the EU has a very limited role in the region from a financial and from a dispersing of funds point of view. Whereas the European Union, with the Global Gateway initiative, is spending over 300 billion worldwide when it comes to funding multiple types of projects. And for example, the EU's projects in the region, the ones which are public and ones which are funded by the EU, include hydrogen plants. The biggest hydrogen plants in the whole region are made in Kazakhstan, funded by the EU. Some of the biggest dam projects, which will provide hydroelectricity to an enormous amount of the populations, come now in Tajikistan and are also paid for by the EU. And these are only the first ones. So these are only ones that have been paid for in the last 3 years. So you can see that the EU is working at a high speed when it comes to this.
In your answers, you also mentioned China. It will be nice to know more about the, let's say, the current level of the relations between the European Union and China. In geopolitics, sometimes we can see some tensions, but I think in the economic perspective, there are much more potential, which can be also mentioned and highlighted.
The EU and China are inherently an important trade relationship, in the sense that China is the second largest trading partner of the EU in the world. Those remain facts, and those are very important. When it comes to, for example, critical raw materials, or when it comes to a lot of resources and a lot of goods, the availability in China is far higher at a better price. So when we look at, for example, things related to consumer products on the European market, and we look at, for example, the labor cost in the supply chains in China, the reason why they're competitive and the reason why the European markets are buying them essentially is because they're at a better cost, and the resources are at a better cost, and the labor is a better cost, and so forth. So that's very, very important when analyzing the EU-China relationship, despite the fact that there are also many problems in this relationship, and despite the fact that in recent years, what the EU has started to notice is, of course, that they're too dependent on certain critical raw materials from China. This doesn't only apply to China, it applies to many places around the world where the EU has become too dependent on critical raw materials. Of course, so that's the reason why the EU has published a whole range of different critical raw materials which it should not be too dependent on and which it needs to diversify from, something which it is also doing at this moment. And then when it comes to the EU-China relationship in Central Asia, I think it's important to mention that, of course, China was earlier out with its Belt and Road Initiative, starting already back in 2013. And when we look at the longevity of the Belt and Road Initiative, it spent about $1 trillion, which is an enormous amount of money. Whereas the European Union, with its Global Gateway Initiative, which is much, much more recently announced, has only been spending around 300 billion. So I think it's important to remember that the EU's is only 1/3 of the Belt and Road Initiative, but that the EU was announced and has been rolled out much later, and hence it still has a lot of time to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. And then comes the second question, which is, do they even compete? Well, on some parts they're complementary. Like, for example, the EU is particularly happy about the fact that a lot of infrastructure has been developed in Central Asia, which the EU, in its relationship with Central Asia and also with the Caucasus, can now use essentially for free. And at the same time, there are also some issues with the Belt and Road Initiative. Like, for example, there have been debt traps. So many countries have been rolled into very, very large amounts of debts towards China, which they've had difficulties coming out of, and which the European Union has a lot of experience with, unfortunately, because the US and the EU to some degrees have been doing the same thing in the 1970s and 80s, which was essentially a big failure for most African countries. So what we see is that China is doing very similarly to some of the IMF programs of the 1980s, which essentially didn't work out at all and created a lot of trouble for everyone in the end. And they're doing the same thing in some countries as well, including in some Central Asian republics, which, of course, is something that the EU has no intention on replicating. And as a result, what it tries to do instead is that it tries to be more reasonable with its funding, give more targeted amounts that it believes that the countries are capable of paying back with basically better accountancy plans. And so that's a major difference between the two, which I think needs to be also mentioned.
It will be nice also to know about the relations between the United States and China. I mean, how it affects the EU-China cooperation.
Well, I mean, I think the major risk is of course decoupling. So human rights breaches in certain provinces of China, which affect our supply chains. I mean, breaches which are at such a level that we don't even have information about it. So the EU is a relatively reasonable trade actor worldwide, I would say. In general, the EU wants to trade. The EU wants to create supply chains. The EU wants to have low cost or at least reasonably cost benefits of trade. But if it is not given the right to access information in a country on, for example, labor rights or on how things are produced environmentally and so forth, I mean, really basic components that can be accessed through the World Bank and so on. If these are not available, then it creates a problem for our supply chains and our courts. And so on that, the risk is that China is not willing to be as open and transparent about how it produces textile business, how it produces agricultural business, how it produces certain manufacturing business in the most western parts of China that have been most contentious, namely in Xinjiang and so on. And so if this happens, then there is a risk, not a general decoupling, but that there will be a decoupling from some of those very high-risk agricultural areas, in which, of course, China will then lose business with Europe. We will, in the European Union, also lose business. But the reality is that even though that might have some immediate supply shocks for our trade, that may not affect other areas of trade where there are not these risks and concerns. And at the same time, it may even actually lead to relocation of supply chains into Central Asia and other nearby regions, which will be able to benefit enormously from these new agricultural and textile-related areas that then are removed from China. So in that sense, there might be a natural balancing which takes place.
Samuel, thank you. Thank you so much for joining IZ Talks today.
Thank you very much.